Hello. We continue our DAR genealogy lecture series today. This is our final lecture of the series. This innovation was done during the Van Buren administration and our pleasure to present to the membership. We spend time today with Patti Lee Hobbs, who will present problem solving with DNA case studies. DNA is increasingly discussed and sometimes used in DAR. Patti is going to take us on a DNA journey with case history that might guide us in our personal research and ultimately in the completion of applications. Patti Lee Hobbs, CG, who resides in Claiborne, Missouri, is a member of the DAR Isaac Garrison chapter. She considers herself blessed to have ancestors from many geographical locations, leading to research in many and varied repositories. She serves in the editorial board for the National Genealogical Society Quarterly and trustee for both the Board for Certification of Genealogies and the BCG Education Fund. Patti is a coordinator for the week-long courses Genetics for Genealogists Beginning DNA at the Institute of Genealogy and Historical Research in DNA Fundamentals for Genealogy at the Texas Institute of Genealogical Research. Her article, DNA Identifies Father for Rachel Lee of Huntingdon County, Pennsylvania, was published in March 2017 issue of the National Genealogical Society Quarterly, and she is a contributing author of Advanced Genetic Genealogy Techniques and Case Studies. Hi, Patti. I welcome you to the DAR lecture series, and we are so glad to have you with us today. And we look forward to your presentation. Ladies, I would like to introduce Patti Lee Hobbs.
Thank you, Daughters of the American Revolution, for inviting me to share this webinar. In this presentation, I won't be able to show how all the DNA evidence was developed. The idea here is to holistically present the cases, showing how DNA evidence and documentary evidence work together to solve ancestral identity problems. The cases were selected because they reflect variety. They are different types of cases, different approaches toward resolution, and difficulty level. They also show some potential pitfalls, which may be due to limitations in our own understanding, whether it's because of our limited research skills in traditional genealogical records or in our limited understanding of DNA. The DNA evidence offered in these cases validates suspected lines, lead to a new research location where proof of relationship is found, and identifies unknown relationships. Several different methods are employed. We may start out by targeting shared DNA segments to determine who shares this segment and what ancestry do we have in common. We might browse aimlessly through the trees of our DNA matches and find something that piques our interest. We always have to use shared matches and sometimes use triangulated segments to identify or confirm hypothesized or unknown ancestry. We search trees by surnames. We search trees by location. We use Y-DNA and autosomal DNA together, and we use a combination of the above. Some pitfalls and lessons learned will be discussed. I begin with the Peel family in Western Kentucky, which is typical of a case where DNA evidence led to a new location to search. Then the records were found. But it also taught me a couple of things about my own research habits and how I might improve them. It also serves to confirm my ancestry, that the biological is indeed what my paper trail indicates. This is my matrilineal line from my mother's 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 line. Through birth, marriage, and death records, I had confirmation of relationships back to Rebecca Bohannon. Rebecca Bohannon married Thomas Dukes in 1868, and of course, often our first line of offense in trying to find our ancestors is to use the censuses. The 1880 census shows Thomas Dukes with his wife Rebecca and their daughter Eva, who was my great-grandmother, in Livingston County, Kentucky in 1880. I'm skipping the 1870 for now because they married in 1868. I want to see if I can find Rebecca with her birth family. I did look at the 1870 census. I'm just not showing it here. In the 1860 census, I found a likely family with R.A. Bohannon, age 9, and with an apparent mother, M. Bohannon, who was a female head of household. There was no male head of household. And we have a household full of people whose initials were used by the enumerator, so we don't know what their first names are here. We compare this with the census 10 years earlier, and which does give first names, and we find that a corresponding family. There are enough of the ages and the initials in common to feel confident that this is the same family in 1850. That household was headed by a John Bohannon, whose wife was Mary, fitting with the 1860 census. Rebecca wasn't born yet in 1850, so she's not here. There is a marriage record in Callaway County, Kentucky, for John Bohannon, who married Polly Peel in 1836. Polly is a nickname for Mary. And if we look back at the context of that 1860 census, we see that the Bohannons are shown in one part of this census, and then 2 doors down is a Peel family. Now, often when young people marry, their parents are nearby. There are exceptions to that. In 1830, there is only one Peel head of household enumerated in that census, and that is James Peel. He has females in his household that fit Mary Peel's age. From this, it seemed likely that James Peel was Mary Peel Bohannon's father. But that would not be, we would be premature in coming to that determination. In looking at the tax records, which often give us a better picture of all of the males that are in a particular county in a time period, we see that James Peel first appears in Callaway County, Kentucky tax rolls in 1828, and then he last appears on them in 1833. It appears that he died. Probate records begin in 1836 because the earlier records were destroyed. In 1842, the family starts showing up in tax records in Marshall County, Kentucky, which was formed in 1842 from Callaway. There are no probate or land records that tie James Peel to Mary Peel Bohannon. The 1860 census is not sufficient to prove relationships. There are no relationships stated in censuses before 1880. And that's as far as the research that I had done on this family and when a DNA match showed up. Larry Cates, any living person whose name I'm using in this presentation has given me permission to use their name. Larry Cates was a DNA match at only 17 centimorgans, and you have to remember that a few years ago, we didn't have the large matches that we see now on some of the autosomal DNA testing companies. So we pursued some of these more distant matches. Larry Cates's ancestor was Robert Peel, born in Wayne County, Kentucky in February in 1800. This gave me a new location to search. I knew from other records, the censuses, the later censuses that give parents birthplaces, that the family had come from North Carolina. But without knowing a specific county, it's very difficult to try to be strategic and efficient about searching. Knowing a county provided such an inroad. It turned out that the Peel family were Quakers. And so Quakers have wonderful records. I always wanted Quaker ancestors because they do have these fabulous records. And in these Quaker records, it showed that Robert Peel was the son of the above, which is David and Priscilla Peel, born the 25th of the second month, 25th of February in 1801. That year is 1 year difference, which is not usually significant in this time period. James Peel was the son of David and Priscilla, and he was born on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1794. This James Peel's age certainly fit with the James Peel in Callaway County, Kentucky. In other Quaker records, James Peel was disowned in 1815 because he married out of unity. So he was disowned from the Quaker faith. As I searched the land records and the probate records in Wayne County, North Carolina, I found that there was a partition of land of Peter Thompson deceased in 1825. And the it was divided up amongst the heirs of his, including James Peel in right of his wife Elizabeth, and it gives a description. So I have this DNA match to Wayne County, North Carolina records, which seems to give this nice family structure for James Peel and Elizabeth Thompson. But there were no probate or land records for John Bohannon or James Peel, as I mentioned before. There were deeds that Elizabeth Peel, so we did know from a deed that Elizabeth Peel was the wife of James Peel in Callaway County, Kentucky. She sold land to three of her children, but one of those three children was not my ancestor, Mary Bohannon. First of all, had I done reasonably exhaustive research? This is one of the tenets of doing quality genealogical research, and I had to come to the conclusion that I had not. So I went back and I looked at what I had. Rebecca Bohannon was born in 1851 in Kentucky. She married Thomas Dukes in 1868 in Livingston County, Kentucky. Livingston County borders Marshall County. She was living there in 1880, but by 1900 she had moved to Union County, Illinois. My grandmother had this paper in her own handwriting that showed that Rebecca Ann Duke was born June 30th, 1851. That certainly fits the family that we found in the census, and that she died in 1926. But I had not been able to find her in those later censuses. In the 1900 census, her name was given as Duke in there. So there was nothing to lead me to believe that she had married, although I knew from other records that she had. So I decided I would try, since I had a death date, I would get an obituary. The newspaper for this area is not digitized, and it wasn't a few years ago when I did this. I had to order it through interlibrary loan from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And of course, I didn't know if she still lived in the county by 1926. But I found a very nice obituary, and it said that Rebecca Anna Bohannon, even gave her maiden name, was born at Smithland County, Kentucky in 1851, and that she died on February 15th, 1926. That exactly matched my grandmother's records. She was married to Thomas Dukes. To this union were born 6 children, and then she later married to Joseph Gray. So I knew about the Joseph Gray marriage because it was in the records that I had looked at in Kentucky. But later on, it says, after telling that she was married to Joseph Gray, who died many years ago, in 1923, she was married to James Keller of Perks, Illinois, who survives her. So this is one reason why I wasn't able to find a death record for her. I had tried to find a death record, but I was not using the right last name. So first of all, she married Keller in 1923 in Illinois. That was an extra piece of information that I had so that I could look for the death certificate. Rebecca A. Keller death certificate shows that she died February 15th, 1926, that she died in Pulaski County, Illinois, which is the county just south of Union County. But it shows that her father was Walter Bohannon, born in Georgia, and her mother was unknown. And this did not match up with information that I had found earlier. You want to keep in mind the informant for this, which was that third husband, and he would not have known her, or likely did not know her in her earlier years, and the only thing he knew was what he remembered. But there was another important record that I had not gotten. Since she married him in 1923, that is after 1877, which is when the Illinois marriage records began to collect parents' names on the marriage license application. So I got the marriage license application. I had to write to 2 counties to find this. I first wrote to Union County and then I wrote to Pulaski County. And I found this marriage record for her, which was for Rebecca Gray, that she was living in Centralia, Illinois, which is not in Union County or in Pulaski County. She was born in Smithland, Kentucky. Her father's name was John Bohannon, and her mother's maiden name was Mary Field. So notice this, that Field sounds like Peel. The marriage license application also shows her signature there below where she signed with an X. So even though this was information she provided, it was not something that she wrote herself. Therefore, the clerk who recorded this misheard her. This is good enough to confirm what I had seen in the other records that I had seen. So that helped establish my genealogy back to Mary Peel or John Bohannon. Now remember, up to this point, I was thinking I might have to rely on DNA evidence. And that didn't make me so terribly sad. I enjoy using DNA evidence as part of my proof. But do I need to depend upon it in this case? Mary Peel and John Bohannon turned out, by doing more research, to be the parents of Rebecca Bohannon. But I still don't have any evidence for this connection to James Peel and Elizabeth Thompson. I went back to the county and I looked in their court records, and I found this court case for Henry Peel versus James Ford in 1857. And it says Elizabeth Peel was the widow of said James Peel deceased, and that Elizabeth by her husband had 7 children. Elizabeth, who intermarried with Jesse Thompson, Mary Ann, who is intermarried with John Bohannon. So there I had my documentary evidence. I just had not searched hard enough. I had not done reasonably exhaustive research. I have done all this documentary evidence back to these families, but my first initiation into trying to work harder at finding those documentary records was a DNA match. So what lessons did I learn? Building a better case with DNA evidence wasn't necessary. I didn't need to try to marshal all my DNA matches and to see if I could build a compelling case that would be convincing to other people. The DNA evidence directed research to an earlier location where I found that documentary evidence. Collecting DNA evidence for suspected relationships is easy because we can search our matches for the surname. But it can make us complacent about the need to perform reasonably exhaustive research in the documentary records. So, DNA evidence cannot substitute for reasonably exhaustive research in documentary records. The other thing I found with this is that quite often we will look at our matches and we somewhat dismiss them because we see these names that we don't recognize. They aren't surnames that we share, and so we don't know how they're related. But once we find a gateway ancestor, such as I found with the Peel family, all of a sudden my Fletcher and Jossie matches made sense because those matches are related to me through the Peel family. I did have a triangulated segment with Larry Cates that I investigated the genealogies of the people all matching on that. And there was another person who also descends from the Peel family. This shows our shared lineage. This is me right here. Larry Cates is 2 generations. He has 2 fewer generations back to the common ancestor. The other third person that triangulated on this segment also has shared Peel ancestry, but her ancestry goes 2 generations further back. So the point of this is that don't dismiss the idea that you may be able to prove DNA further back than you expect. And this means time-wise, because autosomal DNA is diminished each generation by half. But other people who are matches to you may have fewer generations because they have long generations where the parents were older when their children were born. If you have this happening in 2 or 3 generations, you can quickly diminish the number of generations back to a common ancestor. So don't dismiss the idea just because you think it's too far back to prove. I have definitely not tried to prove anything from the, not set out to prove anything from the early 1700s and before. I have tried to set out to prove things from about the mid 1700s to later, but when DNA presents itself with people who are younger than you, both Larry and this other match are younger than I am, and by significant amounts. I think the third person is in her 20s. All right, my next case is one that combines Y-DNA and autosomal DNA, and I used shared matches was my main technique in this, and using the a very small amount of triangulated segments. The proof of the case did not rely on triangulated segments. The case was, who was the father of Thomas Calvin Pratt? John Pratt is the one whose father was born in John Pratt was born in the 1940s. His father was born in 1898. His grandfather, Thomas Calvin Pratt, was born in 1840. These are all very easy to prove. This is the epitome of a family with those long generations. John Pratt, born in 1898, was about 45 when his son John was born, and Thomas Calvin Pratt was almost 60 when his son John Pratt was born. Thomas C. Pratt has a death certificate, and you'll have to take my word for it that the middle name is proven to be Calvin. But Thomas C. Pratt was born May 13th, 1840, and he died in 1921 in Arkansas. Now, remembering his date of birth is important to what we're going to see in the documents to come. It shows that he was born in Wayne County, Kentucky, that his father was Thomas Pratt, who was born in Wayne County, Kentucky, and the mother was unknown. We can pretty easily find the family in the 1850 census. We have Calvin Pratt right here, age 9, and the household is headed by a woman, Lucy Pratt, who's age 35. One of the things that we can see is that she has children that are stair steps: 16, 13, 11, 9, 6, 4, 2. This often indicates that the father has died relatively recently, before that, after that last child was conceived, but of course before the 1850 census. So, one of our first lines of working in the records is to see if we can find any probate records for a family that would include these members. I don't often, if I'm offering generic advice about records to search to find ancestors, tax records does not usually come next. But for Kentucky, it does, because Kentucky has such fabulous tax records. And you can find the names of men in those tax records. Even if he was poor and had no probate record or participated in any land transaction, he most likely would appear on the tax rolls. So, what we're looking for is the disappearance of a man on the tax rolls and the corresponding appearance of his widow. While a woman was married, she would not be assessed for the taxes. It would show her husband. So I searched in the tax rolls, and Lucy was actually assessed for taxes in 1844 and 1846, which doesn't really go along at all with the theory that the father died in about 1847 or after. As a matter of fact, when we look at the tax records, Lucy was assessed in 44, 46, and 49. The only other male to be named Pratt who was assessed in these years was Charles Pratt, and he was assessed in the same years that Lucy was. So Lucy is not replacing him in the tax records. Charles is not her husband. Polly Pratt also is listed in the tax rolls. Now, if we look in the 1860 census, and this was not where we started because Thomas Calvin Pratt was not in this household by 1860, we see that Lucy Pratt, 10 years after that stair-step children household, was labeled and identified as a spinster. People believe that Frederick or Fed Twyford was the father of Lucy's children, and they have some good reasons for thinking that. In that 1850 census, we see that Frederick Twyford is living next door to Lucy Pratt. And in looking at the marriage records, he married Phoebe just in the last couple of years before the census. So he was a single man before that. So it's easy to see that he could have fathered Lucy's children. Also, in that 1860 census, where Lucy is labeled a spinster, she's in the household of William Twyford, age 23, who is very close to the age of the William Pratt in the 1850 census household. Lucy also sold land to F. Twyford for valuable consideration for land that was patented to her in 1854 and on which she lives, and that was in 1856. Also, there is a court record where Frederick Twyford was taken to court by the Commonwealth of Kentucky for the benefit of Lucy Pratt on a recognizance for bastardy. Notice the court term. This is August of 1840. And remember that Thomas Calvin Pratt was born in May of 1840. So he is the most recent child born before this court record. Well, when Fred was supposed to show up in court, he did, but Lucy did not. Therefore, on the motion of the defendant by his attorney, the case was dismissed and the defendant was discharged. Was Frederick Twyford Thomas Calvin Pratt's father? Well, DNA evidence suggested otherwise. I first recommended that John Pratt do a Y-DNA test because, as you'll remember, it was a father's father's father. His paternal grandfather was his was the son, and it would be his Y-DNA that he would carry. Well, predominantly, his Y-DNA matches were all named Dunnigan. I would say, like, all, like, maybe one or two had other names, but for the most part, they were all named Dunnigan. The Y-DNA matches are shown in the box on the left, and the other matches are those through autosomal DNA. Almost all of the autosomal DNA matches with Dunnigan surnames went back to a man who lived in Wayne County, Kentucky. Not only were these people descendants of the Dunnigan family in Wayne County, Kentucky, they were also shared matches with each other. What are shared matches? If I'm looking at my match list, I have a list of matches. Person B has a list of matches. The shared matches are the matches that we have together. Shared matches may descend from identifiable common ancestors or a couple. It's always going to be a couple, whether known or hypothesized. Or they may descend from ancestors before the known common ancestors. The shared matches that you can identify ancestry for help to they can serve a couple of purposes. One is that they may confirm that your biological ancestry aligns with the paper trail that you've developed, or that a hypothesized relationship is true. If they descend from ancestors before the known common ancestors, then those are matches that may help you identify distant unknown ancestors. So the way we do that in Ancestry is I'm looking at my match list here. I select one of the other matches and I click on the Shared Matches tool. It gives me a list of people who match both me and the other match that I've selected. I then go down and look at these one by one, looking at the trees. I'm not necessarily looking for a surname that is the same as something in my tree. I'm looking for either a hypothesized surname, as I would have been in the Dunnigan case, or I'm looking for a surname that is common among the matches. And that's how you solve unknown ancestors. So not only I had these autosomal DNA matches that went back to Solomon Dunnigan, by combining Y DNA and autosomal DNA, and that seemed to support the fact that he was the likely father of Thomas Calvin Pratt. Not only were the Dunnigan descendants shared matches with each other, but they were also shared matches with another child of Thomas Calvin Pratt. So that's important too. John Pratt had a sister named Ethel Pratt, and her descendants also matched the Dunnigan descendants and were shared matches with some of these. In addition, Solomon Dunnigan's family was well known because of some documents, some court documents, probate documents, and land records. Solomon Dunnigan's father was Isaac Dunnigan, and he was married to Mary West. Mary West's father was Solomon West. In addition to the Dunnigan matches, the descendants of Thomas Calvin Pratt also matched descendants of the siblings of Mary West. So you can see here that there are 5 West descendants who also match the Thomas Calvin Pratt descendants. And this is what I call genetic family tree convergence. It's not a new principle, but it's something that's applied all the time to adoptee and unknown parentage cases, but it can also be used for more distant ancestry. If your line of descendants matches descendants from both sides of a particular couple's parents or ancestors, then it's almost certain that you descend from that couple. With Solomon Dunnigan, we needed to consider some other possibilities. Solomon had a brother, James, who apparently had no children, and thus there are no DNA matches with them. Solomon would have been about 47 when Thomas Calvin Pratt was conceived. Potentially, he could have had other children. But his oldest known son was born in 1831, too young to be Thomas Calvin Pratt's father, but perhaps Solomon had a son before he was married. So there's always that possibility, but there was no evidence to suggest that, and the evidence did more strongly point to Solomon. I went back to those wonderful tax records, and in 1838, I looked at all of the Dunnigan men. Remember, 1838 would be an assessment where I might expect to find all the Dunnigan men who potentially could have been Thomas Calvin Pratt's father, 38, 39, 40. There was an A.W. Dunnigan, Isaac Dunnigan, James Dunnigan, and Solomon Dunnigan, of course. A.W. was Alexander, and he is not in the 1839 tax records. And because of the other records involving the Isaac Dunnigan father and the probate records of the West family, we know that Alexander was dead by the time those documents were executed. James Dunnigan may have been unable to have children. And the reason I say that is because he is shown in the censuses married to 2 different women, and there are not children in either one of those households. Now, Isaac Dunnigan, this is not the father Isaac, who was dead by this time. There were some matches with him, but they matched to a lesser degree, and there were fewer of them. You have to be careful about how you interpret that, because there are reasons why there may be more matches with one family than another, and it can be because of the size of the other family. So if Isaac Dunnigan had very few children and Solomon had a lot, then test takers are going to be more heavily represented in Solomon Dunnigan's case. So in looking at these tax records, I looked at 1838 to 1842. And I can see that James Dunnigan was assessed for 100 acres on F Creek. I don't remember what F stands for. Solomon Dunnigan was assessed for taxes for 235 acres on Harmon Creek. A.W. Dunnigan was assessed for 286 acres on Cumberland River. And Isaac Dunnigan was not assessed for any property at all, but he was listed next to A.W. And quite often in these tax records, the names of the men are regional, sort of like the census is. So either because they're parts of militia groups or because they were canvassed, much like censuses are. Then when we look at 1839, we see that James Dunnigan was assessed for 100 acres on the Cumberland River. Solomon, again, 235 acres on Harmon Creek. And A.W. Dunnigan was not assessed for taxes at all. He wasn't listed. And you'll notice he isn't on the tax records at all. The next year's taxes, the certification date is July of 1839. And he's not on that. So if he were assessed, if he is not on that July of 1839, he was not around at the time that Thomas Calvin Pratt would have been conceived. Now, Isaac Dunnigan, he's still no acreage, but now he's listed next to James. So he's in the Cumberland River watershed. Then in 1840, three of them are not listed at all, but Solomon is still on Harmon Creek. In 1841, James has 100 acres on FC, and the rest are not listed. And then by 1842, Solomon is on the Cumberland River. Okay. So Isaac Dunnigan is known to have moved to Indiana. That's probably why he's not appearing on these tax records after 1839. But if he's on the 1839 tax roll, then it's possible that he was still around to have caused the conception of Thomas Calvin Pratt. In the deeds, in the land records, Solomon Dunnigan sold property to Richard Owens in 1853. And there were two parcels of land that he sold. And the first parcel was involving land that was near Twyford and Kinnet land. And in looking at the censuses and what we know about those Twyford and Kinnet's family, they were in the same area in the censuses as Lucy Pratt. But the second tract of land is the one that's most interesting. Beginning with a call from the 50-acre patent of said Dunnigan, and he gives a description to a stake on Stephen Pratt's line. This 50-acre survey was patented to Dunnigan in 1837, and this is 1853 when he's selling it. So he owned this land that adjoined Stephen Pratt's property in the same time period that Thomas Calvin Pratt would have been conceived. So the documentary evidence also supports that Solomon Dunnigan was the one who had the nearest proximity to Lucy Pratt. But we might have some small niggling doubts. Maybe Isaac was the father. But one of the things that we can tell from this is that even if Solomon is not the father, we do know that Isaac and Mary West were his grandparents, and we can proceed with our genealogy from there. I'm about 95% sure that Solomon was the father, just sort of leaving a little bit of wiggle room for other possibilities. Okay, the third case here is one that this is one where I was just browsing through the trees and I saw a match of interest. And this led to a new ancestor for Rachel Lee's father. This is an old interface from Family Tree DNA because this is what it looked like when I found this match. I found Arthur Harvey, and in his tree, it showed that he descends from Caleb Thompson of Huntington County, Pennsylvania. And my Lee ancestors lived in Huntington County, Pennsylvania. It's not a very highly trafficked area, so it's, some places you don't want to put a lot of stock in that because many people's ancestors may have gone through that location, but that's not the case for Huntington County, Pennsylvania. One of the first things I did was to look at the segment that he shared and see if I could find people who triangulated on the same segment. There were no other known family members on there, so that didn't help. I then used the In Common With tool on Family Tree DNA, which is the same thing as shared matches on Ancestry. And this is the new interface. And the way you find In Common With matches there is you use the two little head icons, you click on them, and it gives you the option for In Common With for that particular match. I am presented with a list of In Common With matches, and one by one I go down and I look for their trees. And you probably realize if you've tested with Family Tree DNA that many of these people have very limited trees. So even though it looks like there would be quite a few here, maybe quite not as much as you might expect. But with Laura Kramer, I hit pay dirt, and that was because she had a tree. Um, the trees now are shown with their grayed in or black if somebody has a tree. So I would be looking for the trees this way now. And when I did, I found that she also descends from Caleb Thompson, and she had a wife for Caleb Thompson named Mary Adelman. Adelman was a name I recognized, and it was part of my ancestors' fan club. And if you don't know what that is, it's Friends, Associates, and Neighbors. The acronym was coined by Elizabeth Shown Mills. When you can't find direct records for your ancestors giving relationships, you start looking at people in their fan club. So Adelman was a name that I recognized as being associated with my ancestors, or at least near my ancestors, in some of the records. Now, when I did shared matches with Laura, or I did a triangulated segment, she had only one person matching on the same segment, and that person didn't know her genealogy well enough to be helpful. So in this case, there were different segments. Arthur Harvey matched on one segment, and Laura Kramer matched on a different segment. There was no third person to triangulate on the segments. And as I said before, people who started doing autosomal DNA back in 2012 and 13, before I would say about 2017, that's when autosomal DNA testing really took off and people started getting like tons of matches and you could find closer matches. But back in this early time, pursuing segments was the best way to go. And there are people who still do it, including myself, and is the basis for tools such as DNA Painter. But in this particular case, in family tree DNA, there were no third person to triangulate on either one of those segments. You want to continue to accumulate DNA data. You don't just stop and give up and say, oh, nothing there. Now, GEDmatch is another alternative where we can compare segments and people can upload their DNA raw data to GEDmatch, and GEDmatch runs matching algorithms to find people that are in that database to match with. Now, those people have tested in other testing companies, and that's why you didn't find them among your matches in family tree DNA. In this particular case, Arthur or Jim Harvey, he goes by Jim, there was a triangulated match on chromosome 17 with my half sister Debbie, and her name was Lynn Glidden. I emailed Lynn. That's another thing about GEDmatch is you get email addresses where you can communicate directly with people, and she gave me a link to her tree on Ancestry. And by golly, she had Caleb Thompson and Mary Adelman in her tree. So, just to show you why that was of particular interest to me and what that part of that fan club that I was talking about, how these associations were with my ancestors, they weren't very strong associations. They weren't associations that showed relationship, but they showed that they were near in the right time and in the right place. So in 1810 in Huntington County, my ancestor J. Lee was enumerated next to W. Adelman. And about 3 doors down on the other side was J. Adelman. So here they are, a little bit of a fuzzy image there. Also, John Adelman was a witness to a contract executed by James Lee. It was an evidence of a contract. It was written and witnessed by John Adelman in 1823, and in 1831 he went to court to swear that he had witnessed both Elizabeth and James Lee signing the contract. Elizabeth was James's mother. So what we see here is that John Adelman was near them in 1810 on the census. He signed this, he was a witness to this contract in 1823, and he was still around nearby more than 20 years later to come to court and swear that he had witnessed this contract. The problem that we had, so this is the family that I believe the association must be with. James Lee's wife Rachel is documented in only 4 records. In Pennsylvania before the 1880s, there are no marriage records except for a very short period in the early 1850s. I can't just go and look for a county record finding James Lee's marriage to see who his wife, what his maiden name of his wife is. So all I have is her first name. They sold two pieces of property, one in 1817 and one in 1835. So her name Rachel Lee is in those two deeds. But those two deeds relay the chain of title. So they tell where the land came from, and it shows that James's father, Robert, was the original purchaser of those two pieces of property. Sometimes this is one way that you can find the father of a woman who's married, is by finding the couple selling property that belonged to the wife's family. There was also a gravestone next to James Lee giving Rachel Lee's death date of February of 1843. Now, there was this very short time period where there were marriage records in Pennsylvania. Their daughter Mary married in 1854, and her marriage record named her parents as James and Rachel Lee. No maiden name is given for Rachel. There was no records that indicated any relationship to any other family. I searched in probate records, deeds, court records. There was a newspaper card file index, and there was online digitized newspapers, and there were church records that were abstracted by the DAR. I had these two autosomal DNA matches who were also in common with each other, who were descendants of Caleb Thompson and Mary Adelman of Warriors Mark, Pennsylvania. Now, the other thing that I could see from this is that she was purportedly the daughter of Andrew Adelman, who died in 1795. So the documents created at the time of his death required research. So now what I'm doing is I'm switching over and researching from the Adelman perspective. In the probate records, there was a petition for a guardian by John Adelman. He asked the court to assign a guardian to Margaret Adelman, Sarah Adelman, Andrew Adelman, and Rachel Adelman, the children of Andrew Adelman, and that those children were under the age of 14 years. So there is a Rachel in this family. The other problem that I had was that so far, the three descendants that I found all descended from Mary. Was my Rachel, this that was married to James Lee, was she the youngest daughter of Andrew Adelman? The ages worked perfectly. You can see that the three known children with the ages that are over that didn't need guardians were old enough to where their ages are known. But the younger children were not. And as a matter of fact, no researchers had found what happened to those four younger children. And we still don't know about Andrew, Margaret, or Sarah. So Rachel fits perfectly into this family. As I said, it was problematic that the DNA matches were only with Mary's descendants. One thing that you want when you're looking for DNA evidence is something that we would call breadth of matches. We want to see matches through multiple children of the proposed ancestors. As it is with these three, the ancestor that is shared might be through Mary Adelman Thompson's husband, Caleb. Maybe it's Thompson ancestry that is shared. So I looked for descendants of John and William, the other lines that we knew about, and I did find a couple. Didn't find very many matches on. I think there were only about 3 or 4 Adelman matches on Ancestry. And I asked them to move to GEDmatch so that I could do segment comparisons. And there were still no descendants of John Adelman's line. So I think a couple of those people did move to GEDmatch. I didn't find one who descended from John. I found one, and this is what we call targeted testing. You try to find a descendant that will be a strategic match for you to help develop your evidence to see if that will add to the body of evidence. It turned out that John Adelman's descendant was a find a grave contributor, and he had photographed Adelman tombstones. His last name was Adelman. It was obvious from his contributor name. So I contacted him and found that he did descend from John, and he was willing to test, and he did match these other people. Now, the Adelman records required research to see if any connections to the Lees could be established. As I told you before, I had comprehensively researched all of the Lee records and found nothing that connected them to another family. There was no explicit connection other than, these associations. I had to search in all of those same records: probate deed, court, newspapers, and church court records. Church record abstracts. There were none. There were no connections to any Lee. However, as I researched them, I found that there were some other things that sort of put them together, threw them together in the same time and place. William Adelman bought property right across the county line in Center County in the very specific of Hannah-Furnace. Warriors Mark Township is the very northern county of Huntington County, and it borders Center County. Hannah-Furnace is a little town that's just right on the other side of the border. James and Rachel's son Andrew had lived at Hannah-Furnace, and I knew that from Andrew's obituary, where it told how he had learned his trade at Hannah-Furnace. And James's son John had bought property from the proprietor of Hannah-Furnace. So I had to go and look at the records in Center County to find this. So John is my ancestor. So the problem I now have is that my ancestor was born in 1809. Since the timeline of Rachel Lee's life shows her first appearance in a record in 1817, was she the wife of James Lee when my ancestor was born in 1809? Was she his mother, which is the only way that I would have her DNA? Some of my evidence relied on naming patterns. The daughter who named James and Rachel Lee as her parents in the 1854 marriage record was born in the 1820s, which was after that 1817 deed where we already knew that James's wife was Rachel. James Lee had a son named Andrew. So notice the naming pattern there. They named a son Andrew who was born in 1811. So this is getting us closer to the 1809 birth of my ancestor John. They also had a daughter, Elizabeth, who married Jeffries Thompson, and she was born in 1812. She named two of her children, James Lee Thompson and Rachel Thompson, seemingly named after parents. This brings up another aspect and another sort of lesson learned, although I realize this, but others might not. Notice that she married Jeffries Thompson. And if that name sounds familiar, that's because Mary Adelman's husband was Caleb Thompson. Well, it turns out that Jeffries was Caleb Thompson and Mary Adelman's son. So I would not be able to use their DNA evidence to help prove that Rachel was the daughter of Andrew Adelman, because I would not know if the descendants of Elizabeth Lee and Jeffries Thompson had Adelman DNA because of Jeffries Thompson's mother, Mary Adelman, or the proposed mother of Elizabeth, Rachel Adelman. So I couldn't use their DNA. I had to just leave it out. I tracked the segments using a spreadsheet. Remember, this was published in the National Genealogical Society Quarterly in 2017, the March edition. And at that time, there weren't as many tools as there were, but spreadsheets work great. Any place where there is sort of a coral color is where people were triangulating. So I tracked all of the shared segments among all of the descendants and worked in a spreadsheet. Now, in problem solving, I use DNA Painter. DNA Painter can export all the data into a spreadsheet, but it does all the work of comparison for you as far as giving you this wonderful visual interface where you can see the matches. Now, this case relied heavily on triangulation. That was the main way that I presented my DNA evidence. Each one, there were 6 or 7 chromosome triangulations, and each one of these has one Rachel descendant and at least one of the other children, and often two of the other children. So you'll notice in chromosome 3, Moore, who is my aunt, matched two descendants of John, but those two descendants descend from two different children of John. And this is what I'm talking about with the breadth of the DNA evidence. You want to show that those people could not have inherited the DNA in some other way. In chromosome 11, it's two descendants of William. In chromosome 16, my aunt matched a descendant of John and a descendant of William, and so forth. There were also some pairs of descendants, those that I was not able to triangulate, that I used for additional evidence, and that helped to broaden the number of descendants in both the Lee side and the Adelman side. So in this case, the documentary evidence is weak, but the DNA evidence was strong. And that documentary evidence was enough to link to the unknown shared ancestor into a hole in my tree. So one of the things is that, you may figure, you find somebody that is a DNA match and there seems to be a matching family. Well, how do you know that it doesn't belong to some other short line or hole in your tree? Well, it's usually the time and the place is what works that out. And of course, the shared matches, because you're going to see shared matches with other people who descend from the same families. So, one of the lessons that was evident to me from this is that doing extensive research in the location based records make recognizing possible connections with your DNA matches easier. I immediately thought of that contract as soon as I saw the Adelman matches. All right, so the methods that I used were targeting shared segments just to see what the common ancestor was. Just by looking through the trees and finding a match of interest, I always use shared matches and sometimes use triangulated segments. I search trees by surnames. This is especially useful if you are looking for confirmation of a suspected line. Now, I didn't demonstrate a principle of searching trees by location, but this is how I began when I was trying to identify the case study that was published in the Advanced Genetic Genealogy book. I started with the location where my great grandmother was born to try to find out who her mother was. And in that case, I didn't know who her mother's mother, I didn't know her first name, and I didn't know her last name. But of course, as you can see from some of these case studies, that it was often a combination of the above.
Okay, thank you, Patty. That was great. You've
Oh,
given us some very wonderful information. I have used shared matches before, but it's been quite a while, so I can't wait to get back to my research because I'm to the point that's what I really need to dig in and do. So thank you for inspiring me to do that, and I'm sure you'll inspire others to follow through that great tool. We do have some uh, questions for you. They're not real specific, they're more generic or general questions, but I'm sure that you'll have some answers for us. Number one question: what's the most common misconception you've come across regarding the use of DNA to prove lineage? The most common misperception, she says.
Well, I sort of addressed one of them in the first case study, where people, if they find DNA matches, then their problem is solved, and they don't know how to do. I've been surprised at how many people that are very heavily involved with DNA testing don't really know how to do very good research. They don't know how to find records. They don't know where to go to look for the records. They don't know how to solve problems. So and I really wanted to emphasize that it was my temptation too. My
Mhm.
temptation was to jump to the DNA and to say,
Right.
oh my gosh, I really need to do this other research. So that's one thing. But I would say strictly about the DNA testing, I would say through lines is probably the biggest misperception.
Yes.
People believe that the through lines are accurate and they don't understand how through lines are created. That they don't understand that ancestry is just compiling people's trees, and if they find a common ancestor, and people can actually, some people, just to test things out, will add an ancestor into their tree, and then before you know it, a half a dozen people have copied it, and then everybody thinks it's true.
Well, you're right. The through lines, I've looked at mine and, that has some of it correct, but the bulk of it is not correct. All
Right.
right, question number 2. What advancements do you predict lie ahead regarding the use of DNA to prove lineage? I think you kind of answered that to a certain extent, but you might want to expand on it.
Oh, okay. Well, I think the one of the things is that, we have a lot, we always get new in the last few years have just made things easier and have automated some processes that make
Right.
it's one thing. But there's also the advancements in testing. Y-DNA has the big Y, which very few people have taken advantage of, and successful in using big Y and the SNPs that are identified that are distinctive for particular subgroups of these larger families. And so, and I've seen some very interesting cases on that. And then
Yes.
also, even we may find things through full genomic sequencing. One of the chapters in the Advanced Genetic Genealogy book is written by Anne. It has a title that's called something like "Is It Cooked Yet?" or something, and she talks about future possibilities of expanding the way that DNA testing has been done. So that's a good chapter to read.
I know in Scotland, you might have a large clan and then there's small group break off from that, but they still take that Y with them. And
Yes.
that's very confusing in your
Yeah.
research.
So actually, I recently did a for the local DAR group here, the chapter here, Rachel Donaldson, and I showed an example of that where it's in Ireland, where my McManigal family is a clan of the Doherty or whatever, a sept. It's a sept of the Doherty clan, and yet you can see that in the Y-DNA matching and in the SNP testing, which I've done and stuff. So yeah, pretty neat.
We have that in the McFall name. They go back to the McLean, but they brought the McLean with them instead of the McFall. All right, question 4. Here, any anecdotes from a lineage question that could not be solved with DNA, and why not?
Okay, so I always think of anecdotes as being something that I personally experienced, and this is more one thing I have to is something that I have. There is just sort of the theoretical principles of DNA inheritance. If you have a woman back in the 1600s and you don't know who her father is, there's no DNA test that's going to help you with that. So, the mitochondrial DNA won't work for that, Y-DNA won't work for that, and that's too far back for autosomal DNA. So, there are certain situations and scenarios where you're just not going to be able to use DNA at all. And it's understanding the inheritance patterns of those different, pieces of DNA that we have that help. Something that is more experiential for me is that I have been working on a problem now for a couple of years. And the reason it's a couple of years is because I've been so busy doing other things. But I have a case confident of a woman ancestor whose first name is unknown that I have been able to identify using shared matches and I believe that she goes back to a particular family in a particular county in South Carolina. But the first generation of that family is well established, genealogically wise, but the second is not. And I do not know where she hooks into. I don't even know what her first name is. I just feel confident that she fits into that family somehow. Now, and I haven't done reasonably exhaustive research on the documentary records yet, and I need to do that for all of my DNA matches that are there. And it takes more than just me. It takes other descendants who descend from the same couple that I do, whose wife is unknown, and such. And so, if it's ever I'm definitely going to try to. But sometimes when the genealogical information is not there, it's might be tough to figure out. Even though you can get close, it may be tough to figure out exactly how you connect. So.
Well, and exhaustive research can sometimes be a bar too high. We kind of lose interest at a moment when we shouldn't. All right, Dale, you want to jump to question number 4 again? Do you have recommendations for the best DNA genealogical test to use, and what distinguishes it from the others?
Okay, so I don't have, I don't than others because it depends on what you are using it for. So family tree DNA is the only one that does Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA. So you have to test. They are the first DNA company to do it for genealogy. So the problem is their website is kind of clunky, and they're wonderful to talk to, and you can ask questions and things like that, but they've never really gotten their website to work very good. And so the Ancestry, of course, is really good because it has a lot of people there, and you need to have matches with people who have trees. More Ancestry than anywhere else. And so it can be easier to solve problems, but you can't do that triangulation. You can't find, because they don't give you that information. They don't give you the information about what segments that you share with people. And I was realizing the other day that even if you're working on a case X DNA, you don't know which people match you on the X chromosome, and that could help somebody who, is trying to figure out which particular line that their common ancestor is in. So there are some negatives. Even though it's really good in one way, it's not very good in another way. So a lot of people have tested in, DNA testing and genealogy. They may have tested with Ancestry, they may have tested with MyHeritage and Family Tree. The one that has the most unique subset of test takers would be, and that's because a lot of those people are being advertised to for doing DNA testing for health purposes. So those are not the same people as the other companies. So you're gaining a new subset of test takers by testing at 23andMe. Now, overall, if I were to pick a favorite, it would be MyHeritage. And
Really?
MyHeritage is my favorite because, first of all, they use the test kits from Family Tree DNA, which are easier to do the test as opposed to spitting into a vial. So they use Family Tree DNA's tests. They have a really good DNA interface. They give chromosome browser information, and they have an easy way for people to. So, and they're my favorite. MyHeritage is my favorite, but there's pros and cons to the others.
Sure. That's good to know. All right, last question number 5. In the early days of DNA testing, there were concerns about insurance companies and others knowing your genetic risk. Have this been resolved through legislation?
No, I don't think so. And this is something I thought about telling you. Maybe you don't want to ask me this because I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer it. As far as I know, there has been no further legislation, but there are, I am not sure that some of the concerns weren't, I don't want to say blown out of proportion, but maybe were more concerning to people than they necessarily should be. But you never know what government or whatever is going to do with things. So I totally understand that. But that there's a couple of aspects that it is already against the law for insurance companies to. So that's already in place, and it was before DNA testing became very popular. And the other thing is that all of those, predispositions that people might have, those are rarely isolated identifications of particular DNA characteristics. So they're either a combination of genetic factors that go into play, or they only increase your risk. So maybe you have a instead of a 6% risk, or a 30% risk instead of a 15%. And so, that other factors, the environmental factors, have more to do with whether somebody gets that or not.
Right.
And
Right.
then the other thing is, at least I don't know how this applies to insurance companies, but as far as legal things go, there's a whole chain of custody problem. People can do testing anonymously. They can submit their test. They can use a fake name if they want to. I to know what the real name is, but people that are matching you don't have to know. And of course, if you're putting a tree out there, then people can figure it out sometimes. But so I am all for trying to preserve our privacy and our rights. So that's something that's very important to me. So I don't want to dismiss the concern, but I really like the information that it gives us about our ancestors.
Right. Right. Oh, yeah. One more question. Question 6. What's your favorite anecdote of proving or disproving a family story or legend with DNA?
I have never done that. So this is an easy question for me. The family is, so for one thing, I didn't have very many family stories,
Mm.
and so the couple of family stories that I did have were documentary research, not DNA. So anyway.
And sometimes I found mine were about 3 generations later or further back than they thought or whatever. But
Yeah.
we have truly, truly enjoyed having you here this evening. I'm so glad that you could come be with us, and thank you for all the wonderful information you gave us. As we
Well,
close out
thank
our
you.
last with sure. As we close out our last lecture, I leave you with this thought. Genealogists, the only people who get excited when reading obits. Good day.